It's a letter of response to the Mason County Historical Society. We have in front of us a draft letter, and it's just that, a draft. Do you have copies for anybody else that wants to look at it?
Do have a couple of extras, commissioners, that are interested. And these, by the way, are the ones that I just handed you earlier.
That's the red mark. Okay.
Just some brief background. We can share some, I guess, commissioners. Obviously, we received a letter back in September. We were taken and had quite a bit of input now, obviously, from the FAA. In the latter portion of that letter where I made a few adjustments, and I made the comment, and we talked about this at the last meeting, about the building restriction line, and I modified that slightly to say that there's a building restriction line, BRL 30, that passes through multiple buildings. The airport fence and the northern section, the airport fence and northern section of the West Fairgrounds Road are within the defined object-free area, and the entrance from Highway 101 penetrates the future runway protection zone. And in brief, going back to the airport master plan that was put into place, there is a page 2-26 of the airport master plan. Goes into some technical detail on the GPS approach and also the NDB approach. The key elements that I pulled from this document is the fact that both approaches require at least a minimum of 1 mile to up to 2¼ miles visibility for circling to land on GPS, and the current NDB approach is 1 mile to 2¼ miles visibility. Within the airport master plan itself, there is the planning assumption, and this is critical to understand this is planning too, approach visibility minimums, and what is in our airport master plan that was approved on February of 2013 is visibility minimums below 3/4 mile, require use of a more stringent subroute B-2 design standards, and then further down in that same area, it says it appears prudent to maintain, protect the airspace and related development setbacks consistent with the characteristics of a Category 1 instrument landing system precision instrument approach. So if indeed that's what we are building to, then those areas that I mentioned become a challenge for us with the current building structures that are over there with the fences and also the entrance. So that's the only comments that I would have regarding the letter in terms of the changes that we made.
Fellow commissioners?
Well, as long as we're on the subject of the building restriction line, it doesn't make any difference what category approach that we're talking about. It doesn't make any difference whether it's an NDB or whether it's a ILS or whether it's a precision GPS approach. And the fact of the matter is that BRL 30 line allows a building as high as 30 feet to be located 750 feet south of the center line. That's just the definition of the BRL 30 line. There are no buildings within that 750-foot distance from the center line that are anywhere near 30 feet high. So the BRL 30 is a red herring. It has no impact on safety considerations for this airport in any way, shape, or form, no matter what the visibility or the height limitations are. So to continue to make that argument, all it does is throw more disinformation and confusion into this community about what the actual considerations are for whether or not that fairgrounds has to be removed or not removed. And it continues to crop up, and it has absolutely no validity. There's not a building out there that's over 30 feet high, let alone the museum building. In fact, if you go back to the, I believe it's the 1992 ALP, might be the 97 ALP, there is a BRL 18 on that airport layout plan. And that speaks to and the line itself is laid down at less than 750 feet south of their center line. In fact, that line almost precisely passes through the ticket gate at the fairgrounds. And the comment in there is flat states that a building would have to be over 18 feet high. I figure maybe 14 feet, but it doesn't really make any difference because the roof of the ticket booth is a lot less than 14 feet. In fact, I would say that it's probably no more than 10. So we continue to throw this thing out and say that it's a safety compromise stated in the letter, and it's simply not true.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's delete that sentence from
Delete the
letter.
sentence, if that's what does it, that's fine, take it out.
Let's take it out. John?
Until we, the port and the FAA, have developed and agreed on a transition plan, it is difficult to approve continued use of the property for non-aeronautical use. Doesn't matter how tall the buildings are or where they are or what's the matter with them. Doesn't make any difference at all. So I don't care, take it out.
Okay, any other comments on the letter?
Yeah. Now, moving back into that paragraph that Commissioner Wallachner just quoted, the paragraph starts at the bottom of the first page. And it talks about a number of things that the issue being extremely complicated, and it runs through resolutions and leases and federal and state laws and Work Management Act and grant assurance agreements and the deed itself. And I find as I work through each one of those comments that in fact none of those considerations, if they're considerations at all, lead to the conclusion that is made in the last part of that paragraph. And all of that argument leads up to the conclusion that without, and it speaks to a plan that is supposed to be developed that the FAA is looking for and anticipating. And without the development of with such a plan, the port has no option but to close the property to all non-aeronautical leases at the end of this year. Now, if I follow through all of the argument that leads up to that conclusion, I would argue that the lead up to that conclusion does not support the conclusion. Secondly, that conclusion is a huge change in the position of this commission as it relates to the use of those fairgrounds in 2014. Going back to the meeting that we had with the county commissioners on either the 14th or the 15th of May, I can't remember which day it was, the people that walked out of that packed room down at the commissioner chambers were of the opinion that this port was going to continue to allow the use of those fairgrounds for an indefinite time and with leases on a short-term basis, an interim use, and pretty much an open use of the fairgrounds with the intention of working in the direction of solving the problem. That's what this community felt. That's what the message that was transmitted to this community in the middle of May. This reverses that very violently, and I think we ought to talk about this as a commission as to whether or not we're going to reverse our position from last summer based on these arguments that I find no validity in.
Well, from the May meeting, we did come out and say that we're in favor of continuing use of the property on a short-term basis for non-aeronautical use. And we've held that position all along. The FAA, in this letter, in the letter from Mr. Frist, says we can do that. We can continue to do that with FAA approval for each individual lease. That's what they said. And they will do that if there's a plan to move ahead. We've seen no plan. We proposed a plan that told that we had exceeded our authority when even discussing that. I would love to keep that going down there. I don't want to shut anything down. I want to keep the fairgrounds moving as an interim until we can solve the overall picture of the fairgrounds. We keep hearing that so-and-so is working on a plan, somebody's got a plan over here, somebody's got a plan over there. We have seen no plan. I don't know that the county has seen a plan. They haven't told us if they have. We're the landlords. If you have a plan, bring it forward. We'll work with you on it. We need to have the community support and get going on this thing. We've been told we can't spend any federal money on refurbishing any of those buildings. Where does the money come from to support the buildings down there? It comes out of the taxpayers of the Port District, 1/3 of the county, approximately. We need a community solution to this, a county solution to it. And I welcome a plan. Bring them forward. Let's work on them. And we're not going to throw anybody off, just right out off the street. At least, I don't want to do that. If I get told by somebody under law I have to do it, then we'll have to do it. But we're trying to get this thing going. We need to work together to get it going. And coming in and, I don't know, this letter says, in our letter, we say that we're glad to help with relocation efforts. We are. We're glad to help with relocation efforts for the fairgrounds. We can do things like that. We can move the arena. We can do that. We can provide some other help. We have labor that we can use. We have equipment that can be used. But we have to have a plan. We have to have a location. And I'm not going to commit the county to anything I can't commit the county to anything. But there is property that has been assigned or that was purchased with the purpose of providing land for a new fairgrounds.
It's dedicated.
Okay, it's up by the across the road up here. I don't know. That's the county's. We're holding one meeting here, please. That's the county's bailiwick. That's their business to do things like that. We'll be willing to help. We are under strict, and Mr. Frist in his letter, I think is pretty clear. Give us a plan, and you can continue to have interim use there. I want to work on a plan. We had a plan that got shut down. Our plan was how to start the process to come together with a solution of the problem. So I don't know. Okay, do we want to send this letter to the Historical Society or not?
I have some more comments.
Commissioner, go ahead.
I put quite a different interpretation and reading on the letters that come from Mr. First. In fact, if we put his first letter together with his second letter, and we've only considered his second letter here, he was fairly plain in his comments on the 4th of February in his first letter. And in fact, I and a lot of other people that initially read that letter were very encouraged that what he was really saying was that here's a roadmap to releasing that property so that it could be forever used however the port wants to use it, but leasing it from the well, here's the letter, Tom.
I have it right here, Jay. I've read it 15 times.
Which letter are you talking about?
The one you're talking about from Mr. Fitz.
The 4th of February?
Yeah. There's August. I got February also, got them all. Anyway.
Well, if you read the last part of that letter, it leads you in the direction of how that property can be released. I was greatly encouraged by that coming out of the head of the Compliance Division of the Federal Aviation Administration in Washington, D.C. I thought that was very encouraging, because it moved in an opposite direction of what we've been getting out of the rent notice. So, in what's come out of Washington, D.C. from this, Jim, I see as encouraging. In fact, he doesn't use the word prohibit. He doesn't use the word deny. He uses the word difficult. Until such time as there's a plan put forth that's going to be difficult for them to approve non-aeronautical uses. That doesn't mean it's impossible. All that means is that we've got a difficulty. And what the letter that the draft letter to the Historical Society says is that we're going to slam the door on not only them, but the implication of that is that we're going to slam the door on everybody in this community for use of that fairgrounds after the 31st of December this year. Again, in my mind, the references that lead up to that conclusion in this draft letter don't hold the kind of water that leads me to the logical conclusion that we are in any way, shape, or form required by the FAA to slam the door on the use of that fairgrounds for 2014. It doesn't come together in my mind.
You know, I agree with you, it doesn't say that. But what it does say is that we have to get their approval for leases on that property. That's what it does say.
That's correct.
That's correct.
That's what the deed says.
So, if they don't get FAA approval, what does that mean? We can't lease them, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Have we ever had a lease turned down?
I don't know whether we have or not. I don't know whether we have or not. It's happened in the past, Bill,
At this point in time,
with other entities.
I am now required to basically submit any lease from those fairgrounds to Carol's office at this point going forward. We had a situation already where we had a lease agreement that we were trying to do with Olympic Air and their private property that they own, the building that they own for non-aeronautical use, and we were told no.
Had nothing to do with the fairgrounds.
Sir, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I can tell you this, that if I submit any lease for the fairgrounds without a plan in place, Darrell Sylvia just told me with no uncertain terms, it will be turned down.
Fine, let her do it. We have not had a lease turned down.
But sir, bear with me when I say this. So we're going to go to the fair board, and we're going to say to the fair board, go ahead, here's a lease agreement that we want to sign to you at the end of July, and I'm going to submit that on the 1st of June to Carol, and Carol's going to say no. And then what does the fair board do at that point? They no longer have a location to host their event.
How does that put them in any more ambiguity than they're already in?
At least at this point, they know full well that they need to come to the table and help work with us and others to create a plan to move forward. So if that plan is in good stead, then we can go ahead and lease it to them on a short-term basis. I would throw something else out too, because one of the things that's in the background to all of this, and I just received this yesterday from Foster Pepper, we've had two legal reviews from the port's attorney regarding the authority of the FAA over this land. And I would submit to you that here is Foster Pepper, who, by the way, was the law firm that dealt with the latter part of the eminent domain claim that we had on the port property for the State Patrol. And throughout all of this, and I know, Mr. Rupp, you've been adamant that there has been no case in the background that says the FAA would step in and do that, but we do have the Montero Water and Sanitary District versus the County of San Mateo. Now, this was in an eminent domain case, and it says, quote, "It is well settled that the construction of a deed to which the United States is a party is a question of federal law. Any doubts as to the proper construction of the deed are resolved in favor of the United States." Further down, it says, the act, this was the Surplus Property Act of 1944, it said this act authorized the conversion of surplus military airports to civilian public use airports. However, Congress also wanted to ensure that every acre of a surplus airport is held in trust for a specific purpose and usage. Quote, "No property transferred under the deed shall be used, leased, or other than airport purposes without the written consent of the Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. Continuing on, the Montero decision confirmed Congress's intent to vest the FAA with the authority to make final decisions regarding the use or disposition of airport property, explaining that both the Surplus Property Act and federal regulations demonstrate Congress's clear legislative intent that the FAA, quote, serve as a final check wielding an effective veto power. Congress empowered the FAA to enforce these limitations by retaking the property if it deemed any use or transfer of airport property harmful to the airport's short or long-term interests. The FAA, quote, can block an attempted condemnation of the property by the state and or local government. Now, this had to do with the condemnation thing, but it's still very loud and clear. The FAA has total control over that property, and that's straight from Foster Pepper.
Well, I have never argued that the FAA did not have the authority to approve or disapprove of leases, use, or sale of any of this 1,000 acres as it pertains to non-aviation use. That's exactly what it says in the deed. I just quoted the deed, okay? I've never argued that wasn't in the deed. I read that a long time ago. They have the authority to approve or disapprove. My point in the most recent question is, has the FAA ever disapproved a lease from the Fairgrounds? And the answer to that is no. And so we've never tested it. We have sat here and we have made assumption after assumption after assumption based on telephone calls that if you ever come into the FAA office in Renton with something that this woman doesn't like, she's going to jam it down your throat. We've listened to that and listened to it and listened to it for years. Nobody's ever tested it. Nobody has ever sent a lease up there that she would probably disapprove. Once she disapproves it, then you've got something that you can build a case on. As it stands right now, it's all hearsay. We couldn't make a case to defend a lease at the airport if we wanted to, because we've never had one turned down.
There's another story behind this, and I've been really reluctant to come into this, but it really gets back down to the State Patrol and how we put that all together and what we did and how we stuck it to the FAA without them even knowing about it. And yes, there have been leases that have gone to them that they have turned down. In fact, the 1968 lease for that track went over there in March. Carol and I had quite a lengthy conversation about this because she was reading from one document and I was reading from another. We couldn't put the two together. And finally we did. And finally we figured it out that in spring of '68, a lease went from this port over to the FAA for approval of the lease of 160 acres from the State Patrol, and there was an option to purchase in that lease. The FAA turned that down because they won't allow that property to be sold. So it was denied. So in October of 1968, a new lease was sent over for the lease of that property. There was no option to purchase, and the FAA approved that. What they didn't tell the FAA was 6 weeks prior is this commission at that time approved a Resolution 106, which in effect gave the State Patrol the option to purchase. 20 years later, we lost that case in court because of that resolution. The FAA had the right to revert that land. They decided not to. They're not real kind to us right now because of this action where we keep, I'm just going to say, we just keep stepping on their toes over and over again. They are, in effect, granting us 1,000 acres of property to use for aeronautical purposes. Some exceptions for non-aeronautical purposes can be granted, but they are the ones who control that deed. And to turn around and to just simply ignore the will by law, not only of the deed, but also with the grant assurances, the monies that we've received to build this airport, we have a legal obligation to defend this airport. So you're putting me in a position, sir, is to have to turn around and challenge a lease and then turn around and litigate against the people who want the lease on behalf of the FAA. It's a catch-22. So I think, Commissioner Taylor, if I'm not interpreting the direction you're going, this really, puts us at a point where it's time to say, look, none of us want to see the fairgrounds go away. None of us want to see a fair go away, or Oyster Fest, or any of those events go away. Commissioner, you and I have had a lot of dialogue about this, and you know I fought as hard as you have trying to keep something going with the Hansons and everything else, trying to build a business model around the fairgrounds to try to keep this thing alive. And we've been doing that out of our nickel, not the county's nickel, but our nickel. And a little disappointed that, some people haven't picked up on that. But I think now is the time, with the letters that we have in place, coming from the FAA specifically, coming from the review of Foster Pepper, it's time to really force the issue, folks. Look, if you want to have a fair, the port is here to help you. If you want to have Oysterfest, we're here to help you. The question is do you want it or don't you want it? If the community wants it, let's move forward. Let me throw one thing else at you too, and I know Commissioner, you and I have had this conversation. I get real frustrated about this because my staff has spent, I can't tell you, countless hours doing this. We look at the property down here. Now, those buildings are in pretty rough shape. Can they last another 4 or 5 years? Probably, when it's all said and done. But the infrastructure is where the problem is at. In 2012, in fall, we calculated out, we can bring sewer from over here at the treatment plant, over here to the fairgrounds. $480,000 is the cost to bring sewer over there. Total that with the water and the electrical and everything else that needs to be done, not the buildings, $701,000 is what it's going to cost me to do that. Now, again, this is county property I'm going to address, but this is the property, this is the 40 acres that we're talking about that was assigned for the fair. We've calculated that at $146,000 to put the same infrastructure in place. Sewer is already there, water is already there, electrical is already there. If we can get consensus from the public, for those who want to use the fairgrounds, to work with that, and I believe, I've talked to a couple of county commissioners, there's not reluctance, but they're also asking, where's this groundswell of information, of effort? If we can put that together, we can build a plan. We don't have to be in construction within the next 6 months. Then the FAA will sign off on a plan. We can continue to use the property. In the meantime, we continue to develop the other property and get a system set up in place that works for everybody in the future. This is just craziness. Why are we debating this? Let's do what we have to do. Let's get the group together. Let's get Scoop and Rotary and the Fair Board. Fair Board's already on board with this, by the way. I already met with them. They're 100% behind. When do we start building? When can we start construction? So Scoop and Rotary, we haven't heard from yet. That's the 500-pound gorilla in the room that we'd like to hear from. So let's move forward with this. The FAA, Mr. Rabbi, no disrespect intended, but gosh, we're mincing words here, and we just keep going back over the same territory again. I think that it's time to really start looking to the future to try to fix this problem once and for all. I think this community deserves a better fairgrounds than we've got there, and that will get the airport what it needs and the community what it needs. We just need to move forward. And one thing else, while I'm at it too, your documents of 2007, talk about the recruitment project. I forgot about all of this stuff too. We've already done the plans. We've already drawn out what belongs over where the fairgrounds is at. We've already had that conversation. The 2010 comprehensive plan that we did said, quote, plan for relocation. The buildings are planned for demolition and the site will be redeveloped based on market conditions. The portion of the site directly fronting the airfield should be reserved for aeronautical use exclusively. Space to accommodate a parallel taxiway and apron and hangar development. Other portions of the site may be developed to accommodate mixed use. This was in the 2010 Parks Comprehensive Plan, sir, that when you were chair, this is what we signed off on. So I look at that, I look at the relocation plan, and I look at what the airport master plan says, and all of it says it's time to move forward. So, am I done with my speech? Can I shut
hope
up?
so.
We hope so.
I'm done.
I got a couple of comments.
Well, let me finish something first, right?
Go ahead.
I keep getting in the middle of this fight and my head's swiveling off. I think that we're at a point where we need to start looking ahead. We've looked back to the quit claim deed, we've looked back at this and that from 1968 and so forth. We have known that this fairgrounds lease was going to expire in 50 years. We've known that. I think every port commissioner that has run in the past 15 years, I don't know, has been supporting Save the Fairgrounds. My wife did. Others have. And they found out that you're buttoned up against the 300-pound gorilla in the room, and that's the FAA, the U.S. government that owns the land, or that owns the process for this land, that has the power over this land. And Mr. Frist says that in his letter. He says because it's under the surplus in his letter to the county commissioners, because it was conveyed to us under the Surplus Property Act, then no, you can't be released from the restrictions that was put on there. I can get it out and quote it if you want, but it's in there. So what we need to do is to stop bashing our heads and start working together. Open the doors. Start working together. We need the community to open up. We've seen, we see things about on the KMAS website. I shouldn't mention that because there's other, and I've also seen it on Dietrich's website, or Dietrich's programs, where there's this groundswell of people that want something to be done with and keep the fairgrounds there. We've seen a few petitions. We've seen some signatures. It's 1,600 from the fair.
That it says at the fair, sir, yes. And then
Some 1,600 signatures on that. There have been a few others. There has been no groundswell of what we're going to do to solve this problem. The question has to be asked, not do we want to keep it there, but what are we going to do to solve the problem? What are we going to move ahead to? I've seen some comments in the local media that it's old and it's shabby, but it's good enough for Mason County. To me, that is appalling. Appalling. What do we have for our children to aspire to if it's good enough for Mason County? I don't want to build a Taj Mahal, but I want to build something that people can be proud of. People that built that fairgrounds in the first place were proud of what they did. It's moved on. It's gone beyond. Let's build something that this community can be proud of instead of saying, well, we'll just patch it up and keep it going because it's good enough for Mason County. I don't want to raise my children. The people that developed this country didn't raise it that way. Those people that landed on the East Coast back in the 1600s didn't say it's good enough for now. They went forward. They worked. They conquered this nation. My wife's grandmother walked on the Oregon Trail. Great-grandmother walked the Oregon Trail from Arkansas to Oregon when she was 12 years old because her family had a vision to build something new in their lives. And we need to get that spirit going. We need that spirit here in Mason County. And I'm not seeing it right now. All I'm seeing is the various factions fighting against each other, including us. I'm done with my speech.
Can I make a comment? I want to point out something about this, and I think it's 45 acres next door, John, that's dedicated. I want to point out that there's probably, in my opinion, $200,000 worth of timber on that land, which rightfully belongs to the fairground people. I think you could harvest that timber, clear that land, and have enough money left over to move the stuff we can move and build a pretty nice facility almost immediately. I think it could be done in a couple hundred days. And that's fact. Go over and look for yourself. That land is dedicated. They can have it for $1 a year on a 75-year renewable lease. Over here, even if we get it going next year, they have to rent it at fair market value. That's another FAA dictate. You can't give them a break. So crunch the numbers. Think about it. It's all there. It's doable. And Commissioner Hupp and I seem to be at odds, but it's not really true. We just disagree on interpretations on letters from the government. They're pretty good at writing a letter that doesn't say anything. You know, if you don't believe me, look what's going on back there right now. And hang on to your bank account if it doesn't solve in 2 days. So what I'm saying is the letter from the FAA is emphatic. You got to read between the lines. We don't think it's possible to renew a lease without some kind of a plan, and that means you're done, in my opinion. I'm done talking.
My turn? Well, when it says difficult, it does not mean we mean that it's impossible.
That's because you can think.
It means that there's difficulty. Now, let me read you the last paragraph, or the second to the last paragraph in Mr. Fritz's letter from the 4th of February, which we haven't really brought into this conversation yet. He's talking about, again, the difficulty of approving the use of the land for non-aeronautical uses. And then on top of that, he says, as outlined in chapter 22 of the compliance manual, airport sponsors may request release of airport property. And then he goes on to talk about a couple of different ways that the airport property can be released. But really what he's saying there is that if you folks want to get together with a good case and come to us to release that property, it's contained and allowed in chapter 22 of the airport airport compliance manual. He says that in no uncertain terms. Now he's not.
What
No,
letter is
I'm
that,
not.
Jay?
Excuse
What
me.
letter is it on? Give me the date.
Here, give me a copy of that. It's a copy it's a letter that you got, that this commission got, and it was the first letter that came from Mr. Firtz in February of this year. And it was the first clue to this community that the FAA was not as adamant as what had been coming out of the Renton office, okay? Now, we also, you talk about fair market value. We've also got an entire chapter in the airport compliance manual that this man administers that tells you how a community can lease property at less than fair market value as long as it goes along with creating a favorable relationship between the airport and the community. So we have buried within this airport's compliance manual the answer to our aspect of the problem and the answer to the FAA's aspect of the problem. What we've got to do is come together on some sort of a reasonable conclusion that makes sense for not only this community, but for this airport. Now, as far as the insinuations, and I'm not mincing words here, John, as far as the insinuations are concerned that imply that the FAA has any ownership over this dirt, it's a flat lie. And that's what that deed will tell you. We own this dirt, period. Now, on top of that, it's just the same as if you had bought into covenants for a property owners association that had regulations that went along with the ownership of the land. You can't paint your house purple. You know, those kinds of things that go along with ownership association rules and regulations. There's a stipulation within the deed that pertains to this question that essentially says this: you can't lease, sell, or use any of this 1,000 acres for non-aeronautical uses without the permission of the administrator of the FAA. That is the sole authority, and no other authority is contained within that deed that relates to how this property can be used. The FAA does not have the authority to tell us to do anything on this piece of property. They cannot cause us to do anything on this piece of property. They cannot cause it.
They can deny it.
That's not what I just said. I
know
said
what
they
you said.
cannot cause it. They cannot motivate it. Okay. Now, we're sitting here arguing about, at least it feels like an argument. We're sitting here arguing about an issue that this draft letter, which started this conversation in the first place, insists that we're going to slam the door not only on the Historical Society and tell them to get their stuff out of the museum by the end of this year, but it also implies to the rest of the community that they're not going to be able to use this fairgrounds in the future. When if you go back to what the FAA stands on currently, their only platform to stand on at this point is the airport layout plan that we adopted back last February, still in the winter, yeah, in the winter. And what it says in that plan essentially is that at some time in the time confines of that plan, there is an intent to relocate the fairgrounds, and buildings will be demolished and the land will be redeveloped for aviation purposes. That's a 20-year plan, folks. How come we're forcing ourselves into a position where we're going to slam the door in 2 months on this community, on that fairgrounds? This is a 20-year plan. to get this plan together, to get it solved and get it moving. How come we're not focused on getting it done in the next 20 years? Why are we putting ourselves in a position that is going to cause, I think, great consternation within this community and seriously degrade the relationship between this community and this port by making statements like this and putting it in writing and sending it off to the Historical Society?
Where did we say in this letter that we're slamming the door on the 31st of December?
Let me see. I guess maybe I was reading between the lines a little bit, but what it says is, without such a plan, and we're speaking of the plan that has 20 years to come together. Without such a plan, the port has no option but to close the property to all non-aeronautical leases at the end of this year, period.
Well, then why don't we come up with a plan?
Even if it's a 20-year plan.
I don't care. It should be a 20-year plan. Why don't we come up with a plan?
I think it'd be a hell of a good idea.
Well, what the heck have we been talking about? The FAA has said if you have a plan, we'll work with you. We'll approve interim leases. Then by God, let's get a plan. What's the argument?
I think that would be much better.
Let's stop arguing amongst ourselves.
I think that would be much better than sending a letter to the Historical Society that says that we're going to close the property of all non-aeronautical leases at the end of the year.
Unless we get a plan.
Oh, so you want a plan between now and the end of the year?
No, we're not going to get a plan between the end of the year, but we ought to start it. It hadn't even been started yet. We keep hearing that plans are in the works. We have seen none. Okay, I don't want, there's so much controversy in that letter, I'm not going to, you know.
No response necessary this time.
So are we going to answer them at all?
What would you like to say to them? I tried to propose a letter, and all it did was create a fight.
Incidentally, I thought the letter was okay.
And obviously I didn't. Would you like me to take a crack at it?
And we're going to spend another 3 weeks at it. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I don't want to waste my time with it either. I mean, if it's going to meet the dead letter file before it gets off the desk,
Well, I don't think that any of us are proposing that we throw the Historical Society off the property on the 31st of December. I certainly don't. I think if you just keep going, respond to them and tell them that we need to work together to get a plan going, and that's essentially what this letter says, then we can keep going on it. And, you know, you keep poking the guy in the eye, he's going to get mad and do something about it. And that's what we're doing to the FAA. We keep poking.
well,
It happens, the drag strip up at Bremerton was there for years without FAA approval because they did it on short-term lease programs or processes. Now they've shut it down, or they're going to shut it down, and
it's not shut down.
well, they're going to.
They've been saying that for 15 years.
Okay.
They're going to.
Anyway, I mean, this is what I'm hearing from them. So let's get together and do something. And you know, the fair is not the port's responsibility. There would not have been a fair for the past 3 years if the Port of Shelton hadn't stepped up and run it, or caused it to be run. And Oyster Fest would not have been there for 3 years if we hadn't done it. We went out and spent, what, $7,000 just before this Oyster Fest to upgrade some septic tanks out there.
Not upgrade them, fix them.
Well, replace them. What we had to do. So we're spending money on that. We can't spend federal money on it. So we're spending the taxpayers of the Port District on that fairgrounds right now. I think we need to move ahead. Let's stop beating the horse and let's start working together. I volunteered to set up a committee last year. Not under the port, but as a civilian. If somebody else would step up and do that, I'd support them to no end to do that. Let's get somebody to come step forward and do something about it. I think we're through with this discussion.
I have one more comment. I think this port does have a responsibility with this community over its fairgrounds. If there had not been an agreement back in 1963 between the port commissioners and the county commissioners to bring that fair out of Shelton Valley back onto the property that was originally deeded for a fairgrounds. If that agreement had not been made, I would agree with you. I would say that this port has no obligation to the community. But given that agreement was made, I think there's a huge obligation on the part of this port to honor that agreement, because even though it was not stated, it was certainly implied that the fairgrounds would be there on that property for perpetuity. The reason that they could not move it back onto the original 40 acres that was given to the county for the fairgrounds is because the major aviation development by the Navy was right smack in the middle of that 40 acres. So the minds that prevailed at the time, the leadership, the elected leadership that prevailed at the time, both at the port and at the county, came together and they answered the question of, okay, where can we put it so that it will never interfere with aviation? The obvious answer was south of the runway, because there's no taxiway down there. There's never been an airplane access that piece of property. And unless you go to some extraordinary reason, there probably never will be. So it was perfectly logical that a lease was written for the maximum lease that could be legally written, with the assumption that the fairgrounds would be there as a result of extensions and for perpetuity. Now, the FAA was in agreement with that concept. If the FAA had not been in agreement with that concept, they certainly would have stopped some of the things that went on, like 3 years later taking the water from the north side of from the tower over here, clear across to the south side of the runway. That was a huge and expensive project. The FAA would have said, wait a minute, we're going to drop the hammer on you in 20 years. We're not going to allow renewal of that lease. So I think there's a huge obligation on the part of this organization, and there's an expectation out of the community that we will in fact do whatever we can to honor that intent for those fairgrounds to be there in perpetuity. And I'm going to say this, there is nobody in this room that works for the FAA. None of us. We all work for the taxpayers of Mason County, or the taxpayers of the Port of Shelton taxing district. None of us work for the FAA. But yet there's some of us that are acting that way. And I think it's wrong.
Okay, thank you.
I got it. Well, I'm listening to all this, and I'm taking it in just like you are, and I'm a little bit offended, but that's okay. I want to remind folks of one thing. A county fair is a county issue. You can't ask 12,000 port taxpayers to put up the money for a county operation. If you want to have a county fair, everybody in the county pays for the fair. You know, all we got to do is put out a referendum or something, say you want to increase your property taxes a little bit more, folks, and help us build a fairground. But my point is this. 6 months after the letter that Commissioner Hupp talks about that he received from the FAA, the county Board of Commissioners actually responded to that letter on the grounds that it gave them hope that maybe there was some wiggle room here and they could get the FAA to back off and extend this thing again. So they sent them a real nice letter. This commission approved the letter as long as they didn't change a word in it. Nothing could change. It had to go out just exactly the way that it was written by the commissioners. The FAA responded in August, and they said no to everything. And so the letter in February was negated by the letter written by the county to the FAA and responded to from the FAA, and that's the one I hang my hat on. And it's all right here. We're done. They just say emphatically, I'm sorry, but all of your points are well taken, but the answer is no. You must have a plan to move that fairgrounds somewhere, or you cannot lease the property again on a short-term basis. So it's real simple. We got to have a plan, of some kind in place that the FAA will buy so that we can stay where we are until the new thing is ready. And that could take 5 years. I don't care, you know, but I'll tell you what, John Dobson could put that together in 120 days. That guy right there.
If he wants that.
Well,
Okay.
Anyway.
you know, I think,
You want me to take a crack at the letter?
Take a crack and bring it back to us at the next meeting.
Commissioner, I do have to comment though on one thing. The 1963 lease agreement between the county and the port was never authorized by the federal government. The federal government never did anything about the water line, and there was some money coming off this airport to pay for that water line. So I just wanted to get that clarified. There's also one last piece too that I do want to mention to you about Fairgrounds, and it is from the state of Washington. It's the Airports and Compatible Land Use Guidebook, and nobody seems to want to bring this up, but the bottom line being is that fairgrounds in Zone 5 of an airport are prohibited. So forget the federal government for a moment. Just know that the state of Washington is also saying that fairgrounds in Zone 5 where they're currently located would be prohibited, and that would be their recommendation.
Okay, I thought we were done with this, but I'm not gonna let that pass.
you know, and what,
I'm not gonna let those two accusations pass.
They're not accusations, Jay.
it's just a letter, Jay, that the FAA sent. You got one too.
We're done with this discussion for today.
The last assertion that the Aviation Division of the Washington State Department of Transportation prohibits fairgrounds on airports. There is no prohibition there. We found in the court case that we lost that the Department of Transportation Aviation Division has no authority except advisory in this state, and that was a pronouncement by the Supreme Court of the state of Washington on a case that specifically addressed that issue. So they don't have any authority. So to say that the prohibition of the fairgrounds on an airport is something that is an absolute, it's not, it's a recommendation. At the same time, their recommendations are that buildings and businesses not be put on airports that would concentrate people to unnecessarily expose them to aviation dangers. That same philosophy flows with their thought process. Now, if you take those fairgrounds and you average the man hours that those buildings are occupied over a year-long period and compare that with a business that has 50 people, 8 hours a day in it, you'll find that the average exposure to aviation danger is greater in the business than it is in the fairgrounds. So that holds no water. That holds no water. Now, the argument that the FAA knew nothing about the 1963 lease is dead wrong. That's something that the first time I heard it, it came out of a conversation with folks up in the Renton office that said we didn't know anything about that. Well, I'm here to tell you that there's a newspaper article that was written in 1963 that talks about the PUD being out here on a Saturday morning, ready to put the lines in, and they were stopped from working until they got the approval from the FAA on the lease. Now, don't tell me there wasn't an approval, or the power would have never gone in.
There's no approval, sir.
Well, there was.
Well, we don't know what happened in 1963 or 1968. I think this discussion is closed at this point. Let's move on. We're not solving anything.